and recognizing actually many of us are carrying that trauma to varying degrees. So yeah, I hear what you're saying exactly, and I can take some solace from that as well.
A lot of my life is either yoga or it's dancing. It's a really big part of who I am and inspires me in my leadership capacity.
Sophie believes that all workplaces should support their people in the freedom to make decisions, to be curious, and provide the mechanisms to play and innovate.
One area I'm really interested in is around sexual dynamics and sexual energy in the workplace.
Hello, and welcome to Confessions of a Successful Leader, hosted by me, Andrew Tallents, the self-coaching expert. In each episode of the show, we hear the insightful confessions of a successful leader who wants to inspire others to live their professional and personal dreams. I am always keen to hear your feedback, particularly in relation to the kinds of leaders you would like me to invite onto the show in future. But for now, sit back, relax, and enjoy the rich insights from our special guest. Hello and welcome to another episode of Confessions of a Successful Leader, hosted by me, Andrew Tallents, the self-coaching expert. I'm delighted that Sophie Bryan has joined me in the studio today. Sophie is an experienced coach with over 10 years experience and 4 coaching qualifications. She is a certified practitioner with the American Board of Neuro-Linguistic Programming, a Coaching for Performance accredited coach, an ILM endorsed coach, and management and certified coach with the World Institute of Action Learning. Sophie believes that all workplaces should support their people in the freedom to make decisions, to be curious, and provide the mechanisms to play and innovate, all in aid of high performance, the greater good of humanity and the planet. So it's Sophie's mission to bring all these things to the workplace so we can all have happier, healthier, and productive lives in and outside of work. Sophie has 17 years experience working in leadership, HR, learning and development, and culture change. She is the founder and CEO of Ordinarily Different Limited, a workplace culture consultancy, co-founder of Rebel Leadership Limited, a purposefully mischievous leadership consultancy, and the founding coach of sophiebryan.co.uk. Sophie also has a background in nutrition and personal branding, and she's a qualified yoga teacher. Sophie, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Andrew. Wow, that's quite an in-depth bio you've just shared. Some of this stuff I even forgot about myself, so thank you for reminding me of all of that.
That's all right. And what I love about this show is, we see that publicly in terms of that information, and obviously, they're your credentials. But I think what the audience really wants to know is who are you in terms of away from work and what makes you the person that you are. So just tell us a little bit more about yourself and what your current focus is.
Okay. So, workplace culture has been my bread and butter really for over 20 years now. I started my HR career when I was 17 years old. So I grew up in the workplace. I matured in the workplace. I grew up kind of creating who I was around the leaders in my organisation and learning to kind of craft my career very early from that perspective. So workplace culture is my bedrock, I think, of who I am and what I do. But I think I'll give a little bit more context to the yoga and nutrition and the image consultancy stuff that you referenced, because it might feel a little bit out of kilter, perhaps, with the space in which I occupy. Heavily corporate-based role that I and my business does, working with civil service all the way through to private sector. So where does this yoga nutrition stuff come in? So to kind of answer any of that for people that might be curious about that, I was an ex-HR director. I left my position 6 years ago, and it was in that role that I started to notice what we was doing to people from a health and wellbeing perspective, not just from a mental perspective, but from 2:00 in the afternoon, people would be rushing to the vending machines to buy chocolate, Coca-Cola, crisps, just to get that sugar hit, that caffeine fit to sustain them through the remaining hours of their working day. And it got me thinking about actually, how do we sustain ourselves for work? how do we fuel ourselves for work? And so it was from that position that I decided to train in nutrition. And now I talk about nutrition as part of workplace culture. In the same way as I did with yoga. Yoga's been part of my life since I was 18. And so over 20 years now of me being an avid yoga practitioner. And so I decided to train in that too, because I also noticed the musculoskeletal impact of being at work was having on people, and the lack of movement, the lack of stretching, the lack of embodiment that we have when we're in a corporate environment. And so I wanted to bring that aspect into it too. And so now a big part of my work, and why the work I do is quite different to most workplace culture consultancies, leadership consultancies, management consultants, is because I take quite a soulful and spiritual steer on the workplace experience. And I bring a lot of the yogic principles into some of my work, even if we're dealing with culture change, we're dealing with redundancies, restructuring, mergers, acquisitions. There is always more of a really humanistic, soulful element to that piece of work that I'm doing, rather than it just being something that's more structured and more management led. So I guess that's my steer on a little bit more context to my bio.
Thank you. And I've just started to explore yoga at the age of 54, and I'm finding some forms easier than others. But what have you seen over the last 20 years in terms of people's attitude towards yoga? How has it changed, if at all?
Okay, so there's many things to say on this. I think the first thing to say is yoga was seen as something quite woo-woo. That's what
Yeah.
the hippies do. The hippies go off and they
Yeah.
go sit and meditate and have the incense and stuff. And over the past, I think probably 7 years or so, it's become more mainstream. You see many classes now in the local gym. They're popping up in the local village hall. People are going on yoga retreats. So it's now seen as something that people are wanting to move their bodies for. But also with yoga, there is a way of life. There's a philosophy of belief around why you should look after your body, why you should move in that way. And it's with that philosophy that I'm also seeing that change as well, in that it's not so it's seen as spiritual, but it's welcomed now as something that could also be a spiritual practice, or not. Take it and leave whatever parts of yoga that you wish. And I guess that's the beauty of it, that you can encourage as much of it into your life as you want, or literally just go to the gym, do some downward dogs and go home again. But that has definitely shifted as well over the past couple of years. And actually, to say that you're a yoga teacher or you practice yoga is probably more common now than what it's ever been. So yeah, good on you, Andrew, for taking it up.
Yeah, I need to become a bit more supple, but I guess that's what part of it is. I want to do it for my core as well, and for the other things that I do. So now,
Mm.
outside of work for you, so you give us some great context there in terms of what you're providing, in terms of obviously the work that you do from a cultural, corporate perspective. What about when you're not working? Give us an insight in terms of Sophie outside of work.
Oh wow! So I am a big fan of dance. Everything about my being as a leader is about embodiment and being in my body and encouraging other people to be in their bodies. And so I'm in love with dance. I would spend, if I had an alternative career, it would be as a dancer. So I dance ballet. I took up ballet when I was 33, so 6 years ago now. And I've done my bronze, silver, and gold medals in ballet. And I've now just started to dance on point as well, which has been a childhood dream of mine since I was 7. So that's quite a big accomplishment for me at the age of 39 to be doing it, thinking about my 7-year-old self
Yeah.
wanting to wish to put those shoes on. I'm also a burlesque dancer, so a complete difference between the pureness and innocence of ballet to the more risque, deeper, seductive aspects of burlesque. And I'm now starting to perform as well. So I've got some shows in London that I'm performing in. So that's very exciting for me. And I'm also an ex-salsa teacher as well, with a background in Latino dance. So a lot of my life is either yoga or it's dancing, to be a really big part of who I am, and inspires me in my leadership capacity wholeheartedly.
let's link back to the 7-year-old self. So what we talk about on this
Mm,
particular podcast and show is, how do our
yeah.
childhood experiences inform us as leaders? And obviously you've been successful in your career in corporates and in consulting. So just give us a sense of how your early sort of life experiences shape your leadership style.
So my childhood was, I wouldn't say traumatic, but it was difficult. Um, it's funny you mentioned the age of 7 because that's actually a time when I was very poorly. At the age of 6 and again at the age of 7, I had pneumonia and I was admitted to hospital on both occasions and took many months of rehab to build up my lung capacity again, having to have physiotherapy 3 times a day. Missed so much of my school life while I was 6 and again when I was 7. And so I think that moment there, notwithstanding everything else that happened in my childhood, but that particular experience of being so poorly taught me several things that I can now see how that's transferred into my leadership and how I show up in the world just as me, irrespective of what role I'm playing, is one, I have such a strong regard for my health and I will not do anything that jeopardizes my health in any way. And my health is my top priority. In terms of values, my health will always be number one. So that's driven a lot of my behaviours around how I perceive the workplace because I want other people to have a regard for their health as well. And I've seen the effects of what that does to people when they don't have that regard. The second thing for me was my lack of education when I was 6 and 7 because I missed out, 3 or 4 months out of school at that age in your kind of infant years where you're learning phonics and you're just starting to get to grips with, writing your name and spelling things. Um, so because of that, I believe that's where it came from. I have been such an obsessive and committed learner since that time. And it was very uncomfortable for me, obviously being in hospital, being so poorly, but knowing I was missing out on knowledge. And it's one of the things I actually I can't tolerate is missing out on knowledge. And so much of my life now moving forward has been about immersing myself in as many courses, conversations, books, podcasts, audiobooks. I'm swimming in information and new knowledge. And I believe part of that has come from my childhood when in those moments I was denied the ability to have education because of how ill I was. Um, and then I think because of where I think the conversation may steer itself in this conversation, I'll also just mention that I grew up in a home where my father was very poorly from a mental perspective, had post-traumatic trauma from being in the Merchant Navy in the Falklands War, and as a result of that was an alcoholic. And so I grew up around my dad not really living the life that I knew he deserved to live and not really being able to deal with the mental torture he was experiencing and how I saw him deflect that into other sources and it manifesting itself in all sorts of different behaviors, which I have come to a point of forgiveness around some of the things that happened to me in my childhood, but also realized the gift that my dad gave me in him showing up in that way, because that has really formed who I am today in terms of my leadership style.
And that sends tingles down my back because I can relate to that totally. And that my mum had mental health problems when I was about 15, 16. My dad was working away in Saudi, and similarly, it wasn't the same as you in terms of the alcoholism in the house, but actually I had to really just shut off a lot of my feelings and emotions. So that leads on to the next question to you, in the sense of, for me, that meant that I was very successful in leadership because I could become focused. I didn't necessarily think about how I was hurting people sometimes, and I was just very driven. So I only learned that in my mid-40s that I had to change who I was in relationship and actually start connecting my feelings and my somatic and my body in that sense. So what about you? What was it for you about your childhood that maybe really made you successful, but you started to learn maybe wasn't as helpful as you became either more senior or more experienced?
Oh gosh, wow. Andrew, on this one, I really felt the hard way on this one. So, because of my childhood, because of my upbringing, my home was not wealthy at all. I wouldn't say we were impoverished, but we struggled financially consistently. So as a child, we would not have the TV on for 3 months because my parents just couldn't afford the TV license. So we had the absolute basics. We were fed, watered, clothed. But anything else outside of that was just a no. So we don't need TV. We're not paying for it. And I always knew that I never wanted to create that kind of life for myself as an adult. And so what that kind of childhood gave me was this need for abundance, this need to be surrounded by nice things, this need to be able to have not just the TV license, but Sky TV, things like that for many of the children I was growing up with, especially into my senior school years, they had access to that like it was nothing. And for me, it was a real shock to go around a friend's house and be able to watch Nickelodeon TV because they had Sky and I didn't have access to that. So abundance for me was critical. Abundance financially, abundance of things, abundance of friendships. I just wanted to gather as much as I possibly could of anything and have lots of it. And so that then drove me to be, right, well, how do I get this then? I'm going to have to get this abundance through hard work. And I'm going to have to craft a career for myself that pushes me so that I am the absolute best I can possibly be. And I did all of that. And so I started my career at 17 and I gradually worked my way up to being from a HR assistant to HR advisor to HR manager, head of service. And then eventually at the age of 32, I became a HR director. And all the way through that, Andrew, I pushed and pushed and pushed and pushed because I knew I wanted the big house. I knew I wanted the nice car. I knew I wanted to just be able to go out for a nice dinner anytime I wanted to and not have to worry about what was in the bank. And that was what was driving me. How it broke me and how it affected me negatively is because I got to the point where I thought I've reached the pinnacle of my career now as a HR director, and to have got there at a relatively young age as well. And I kept pushing, and I stayed there way beyond the time I should have done because it was serving me, giving me a lifestyle that I'd been working for since I was a young child. But in doing that, I was not congruent with who I was. I was doing a role that was asking me to be something that I wasn't. It was asking me to work against my values. It was asking me to compromise my health. It certainly compromised my sense of freedom. And as a result of that, I ended up going off sick. I was off sick with stress for 3 months. And then I can only really explain to you that in that time, I kind of lost myself. I had no idea who I was anymore because I'd been driving that sense of identity for such a long time. Be successful, get the academics behind you, get the experience, become the executive. Again, push, push, push. And I had never once stopped and gone, does this really, truly align with me? And it was clear that it wasn't. And that's why I broke. And it was at that point that I then decided to leave the corporate world and start my own business, which then enabled me to have that freedom, that sense of health, and to really, truly find myself again. So, yeah, it was a very long, painful journey. But now 6 years on, I couldn't be happier in the position that I'm now in and the impact I now have to make.
Sophie, again, I can relate to your story. So I set my business up back in 2017, experiencing something similar in that way. But what I did, and I'd be interested in your journey at the start of you setting the business up, is I started behaving in the same way in the first 2 or 3 years of my business. I wasn't in the corporate anymore, but I was still driving myself to be successful, to be able to feed myself. So how did you adapt your leadership style of leading your own business and how you were with clients compared to how you'd been before you burnt out?
Oh, gosh, this is such an interesting question because my story is quite similar to yours, Andrew, in that respect. I quit the corporate world and still carried on kind of being a bit corporate-y because I thought that's what my clients wanted from me. And actually that served a purpose. It got me through some doors. It got me into some big organisations, got me involved in some big projects. And ultimately, I was still being the same version of Sophie as I was as a HR director. only I had a bit more freedom around my day. Nobody was bossing me around and saying, you need to come to this meeting, I need this report from you in 2 hours. That had gone, and that was the biggest pain point for me, because I struggle with not having agency over my own time and what I want to contribute. But the rest of it remained intact. And it's only really been, so I'm 6 years now into running my business. It's only really been the past 2 years that I've really felt into my authenticity and gone, okay, who am I really? Do I really want to show up as this person, like a carbon copy of all the other culture consultants and the other leadership? Do I want to be a carbon copy of that? Or do I want to carve a niche for myself by being true to who I am? And then the right clients will find me, rather than me trying to find the right clients. And once I stepped into that space, I then went on a really long, luxurious self-discovery program of, who am I really? What are my wants? What are my desires? What do I live for? What do I wish for? What's the change I want to see in the world? And when I really tapped into that, I then found the true me. And now the work I do is the truest it has ever been.
I love your story and I can relate to it so much. The next question, which you're not going to be surprised to know, is because you've gone through this process, and many don't get there, by the way, and we know this from the people we work with, of having that awareness of actually, I want to be, who I really am, going back to that 7-year-old, if you like, about where the magic was, this love of dance and who you are, is once you've done that and then you start on this being authentic with clients and being who you are, it's sometimes difficult, again, when we're triggered, to actually maintain that. So what do you do? What strategies do you have to keep that negativity away and fall back into old Sophie and make sure that you're showing up as who you really are?
I kind of feel a little bit unapologetic now, Andrew, around who I am and how I show up. And I think I've got to the point now where sometimes I can be triggered, and sometimes I'm like, oh, do you know what? I could do a really good job in that organisation, or I could put in a really good proposal for them, and I know I can help change them, but I'm going to have to be a little bit more like this. And where I know I thrive is more like this. I have to make a judgment call on that. And most of the time, if it's going to require me to be something that I'm not, then that's actually not fair on the client either, because they're not going to get the best version of me. They're not going to get what I know I can deliver for them. And there has been many a time I've turned down big projects before where I know I'd have to step into being that person, and I did not want to do that. So I guess the strategy behind that is, I have these mantras, and I've already kind of mentioned them already, is I go into myself and I ask myself, what do I need? What do I want? What do I wish for? What do I desire? And if it doesn't point in the direction of that project and how it's going to make me feel, I simply won't do it. If I tap into what do I want, what do I need, and it feels like a really good fit, then I'll also go with that. So it's those little mantras, those little questions that kind of guide me back to the core essence of who I am.
And what I love about that, again, is sometimes, there are difficult questions to ask because sometimes we think we don't know. I remember working with a client once where I asked them, what is it you really want? And she burst into tears. She was a very senior chief executive, but nobody had really taken the time to ever ask that of her. She was always selfless for other people, brought her family up. And yet when she really asked herself about what she wanted, it was already there. It was deep rooted. She knew what it was, but she'd never expressed it. And so I think when we do that of our own agendas to make decisions about the projects that are there for us, it's usually the right way to go. So thank you for that. And then finally on this piece, how do you make sure that we all have negative thoughts? We have hundreds a day. How do you make sure that when those are coming up for you, you utilize them in some way to come back to neutrality or in a positive state to, again, make sure that you can show up as who you are?
So I guess it's a different answer, but along the similar lines to what I've said previously. So in my professional work, I encourage my clients, whether that is in a one-to-one coaching relationship or I'm doing a mass scale culture change project, I encourage the organisation, the team or the individual to compose what I call a fundamental purpose question. And I have my own personal one of those too. And it's that fundamental purpose question that is a combination of your values, what's driving you. And it's that one question you can keep coming back to say, is how I'm feeling right now negatively in this, oh, this doesn't feel good. Is that driving me further towards the thing I'm trying to achieve, my fundamental purpose question, or is it taking me further away from that? And so if I'm experiencing some negative emotions, perhaps I'm feeling some sense of rejection or a lack of recognition. Perhaps I've done an amazing piece of work with a client and I think that was incredible. And they're like, yeah, it was all right, Sophie. And I need some recognition from that. Or I've put in a big proposal for something and I was like, yes, this is going to change their world. And they've gone, no, I don't think that's for us. So again, there's a rejection there. I will always go back to my fundamental purpose question and ask myself, is this taking me closer towards this thing or is it taking me further away from it? And that quite often will move me into neutrality first. And then I can take some positives from, do you know, actually, Sophie, the fact that you haven't won that contract now means you've got more time to build this new business, or you've got more time to write the book. Or so there'll always be then a positive context that comes from it, which then actually is driving me towards my fundamental purpose rather than taking me away from it.
I've got people in my friendship groups and in some of my clients as well where they always manage to see a gift, an opportunity in even the most difficult circumstances. And as you say, if that can take us towards our purpose, then even better. So we're coming towards the end of our time together. But for those people that are listening and watching this, in terms of them resonating with your story about childhood, where they came from, their rise in terms of their careers at a young age, and then potentially either thinking about doing something different, living to their purpose now or in the future, what advice would you offer to those leaders that can relate to this story in terms of how they channel those early childhood experiences into a sustainable life for themselves?
So my childhood, I've been through 9 different sets of counselling and psychotherapy because of the various different things that happened in my childhood. And it's only now, at the age of 39, I can talk about it with some compassion. I can talk about it with some forgiveness. And I can talk about it with a wow. There's some real gifts in that. If that hadn't happened to me, I wouldn't be where I am now. So for anyone else listening to this that may have a similar journey or are on a path of dealing with perhaps some of the trauma or difficulties they had in their childhood, I think the first thing I would say is you can't hurry that recovery. I don't believe there is a fast track to dealing with trauma. And that every day something new will come up. There'll be a new trigger. There will be something that sets me, oh my gosh, I hadn't dealt with that bit. I thought I was free of this now, and something else comes along. So I think patience is absolutely critical with that. I also think self-love is also important with this, because it's so easy to beat ourselves up over the emotions that we feel and tell ourselves we are wrong, we aren't good enough. And so we need to have some self-compassion and some self-forgiveness to us for how we talk to ourselves before we can even really start dealing with the work that's happened externally. So patience and self-love, I think, are the 2 critical factors for me in me stepping into the space that I'm now in.
Thank you for those wise words. And I read late last year Gabor Mate's new book called The Myth of Normal, where he talks about exactly what you're talking about in terms of the fact it is more accepted now that there is intergenerational trauma, which we obviously have as part of us, and then the trauma we experience as children or early in our lives. And again, he talks about being accepting of that, loving ourselves for that, the gift within that, and recognizing actually many of us are carrying that trauma to varying degrees. So yeah, I hear what you're saying exactly, and I can take some solace from that as well. So final question for you. Obviously you want to talk about the future and what you're going to be doing, because you've got a lot of your years yet to give. So who or what are you going to be in service of in the future? And if anyone listening to this wants to contact you to collaborate with you in some way, or engage you as a supplier to them, what's going on for you now?
Okay, so a little bit of a curveball here, Andrew, in terms of what my future looks like. So obviously, a lot of my work I've alluded to is around workplace culture. One area I'm really interested in is around sexual dynamics and sexual energy in the workplace and how that manifests itself in leadership and workplace culture. And I'm not talking about this from a sexual harassment perspective, and I'm not talking about it from a gender equality perspective. I'm talking about this purely from an energetic center that we have within us, and it exists in all of our relationships, but we don't ever think about it in a workplace context. And so I've spent the past year studying sexuality, human dynamics, relationship psychology, sexual psychology, and I'm now in the position where I'm writing a book about this. And equally, I'm now starting to talk to organisations around what those sexual dynamics look like in the workplace and how they are harming, but also how they can be used for such immense good, such as creativity, collaboration, and connection. So that's where the newest steer is, the newest layer of that. And as part of that, I'm also trained as now a sex life coach. So to add on to all of the other coaching qualifications, Andrew, that you mentioned at the beginning, I'm now stepping into coaching people on their sex lives as well. So I have a new business called Sex and Soul, which will encompass that. It will encompass body image, and it will also encompass my dance. So I'm starting a dance school as well. So all of that, as well as workplace culture, is my new future. If people are interested and curious either about the workplace culture stuff or this now nuanced steer, or even the sexual stuff personally, they can find me on LinkedIn under Sophie Bryan. You can also find my TED Talk as well. If you just Google my name and TEDx, then it will come up. And then for most of my work, you can find me at ordinarilydifferent.co.uk.
Well, Sophie, it's been fascinating listening to you. I've learned so much. I really appreciate the experiences that you've shared, for being so open with us about your early experiences and also what you've been doing more recently and the journey that you've had. I know the audience today would actually have taken their own little learnings from that, and hopefully they'll apply it to how they lead themselves, how they lead others, how they show up and be more authentic in that. I just wanted to say again, thank you very much for coming on the show today.
Thank you, Andrew. It's been a real pleasure, and it's been very soothing for my soul actually to share some of this out loud. So thank you so much for the opportunity, and if it enables any of your listeners to step into a new space with their journey, then it definitely feels like I've contributed something. So thank you very much for that.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of Confessions of a Successful Leader. You can access all previous episodes of the show at confessionsofaSuccessfulLeader.com. If you are interested in finding out more about conscious leadership and self-coaching, just type in Andrew Tallents into LinkedIn or your favourite browser, and you'll find my contact details and all the content that you need. Until next time, don't forget to stay present, curious, and above all, conscious.